Hello everyone. Here's one more optional idea for your virtual reality dream room. Now, I expect a lot of folks have long since stopped, achieved what they wanted to achieve, and that's fine. But if you are jonesing for more interactability, in your project. This is where we kind of fork off into a whole other way of doing things. I've been trying to keep us out of the programming world, and because my student's background is not in programming, right? Mine neither. And so we're going to try to stay out of that realm. But as of right now, when I'm making this video, I find VRTK, which we've been using to kind of bootstrap us this whole time, I find that it is unreliable for more complex interactions right now. That could be them or versions, or them and Unity, or it could be me, but there's a lot of shaky physics problems with some of the more interesting interactability that I'd like to use. So instead, I want to rethink this as a SteamVR based project, because SteamVR provides assets that are also really good at interactivity. I don't think their simulated camera rig is as good as VRTK's, which is why I've been leaning on VRTK this whole time. But they do have one, and so we can do this if you want to come along for the ride. So the way we would approach this is go into your folder where you've been saving all your Unity projects, and in the one you're working on, duplicate it, make a copy. So I'm going to copy here, and this is how we're essentially backing up our project. So we're going to close the VRTK based one after this, and we'll add the SteamVR project to our Unity hub, and we'll work with that so that we have an unaltered VRTK based project if we want to go back to, if we regret this. If your project's open while you're doing this, you will have to close right at the end. All right, so rename that copy with SteamVR at the end of it. Fire up Unity Hub, and then under projects, let's hit add and choose the SteamVR version of your project. We'll open that up, and we're going to go to the asset store and search SteamVR. So first time you'll click download, and then after that you'll hit import. It'll take a little while to import all of the SteamVR assets. You'll want to choose everything, which is selected by default. You hit import. Hit accept all when it's got complaints about whatever your setup is, and then you should be good to go. Go back to scene mode, and now this is where you'll get mad at me. We are going to make the whole VRTK setup inactive because we're not using it anymore. Likewise, the interactable objects that we set up before, we're going to twirl those open and just go into the meshes and pull the meshes out, and then make the VRTK interactable object inactive, because that way of doing things won't work for SteamVR. I'm just choosing to make these things inactive rather than deleting them, just in case we want to undo what we've done here. And so now we need a whole new camera rig. We're going to go into SteamVR and then Interaction System, Core, Prefabs, and Player. Okay, so that is our camera rig now. I'm gonna set it up there and then hit play to test it out. If you have a headset, it's going to complain to you that you haven't set up your controls, your input controls yet. And if that's the case, you hit yes. And you hit yes again when it says you don't have an actions file yet. It'll make one for you. And we accept, hit OK, and then we hit save and generate. And it'll take a moment to generate a default assignment of what all the controller buttons are for your particular controllers that you have attached to your computer. If you're running this with no headset at all, it won't even ask about this. So you're ahead of the game. So now we should have everything working. And down here on the bottom, you can hit 2D debug if you're in a headset. If you're not in a headset, it should go to this view automatically. And similar to VRTK, you can do WASD to move around. You can hold right click to turn the camera. And then you can't really assign buttons in the same way that you could in VRTK, but your mouse is capable of doing a single interaction on interactable objects, but the trade-off is there's a lot more you can do with the interactable objects in the current version of SteamVR rather than where the current version of VRTK is. In theory, VRTK can do all of these things I'll describe, but right now I think version mismatch is causing a lot of errors that aren't worth fighting over at the moment. So in SteamVR, to make a object throwable, you select that object and you add a component and you start typing throwable. Throwable comes dependent upon a couple of other components, and so it will bring them in. It'll bring in interactable and rigid body. And so now that we have those three on, there's one more thing that you'll want to add, and that is a velocity estimator. And velocity estimator is going to pick up the velocity of your controller movement and apply it to the thrown object. So if we hit play now, I can grab the object and throw it. And in the 2D debug version of that, it does work with the mouse's single clicking button. In SteamVR, to get teleporting going, you go into SteamVR, interaction, teleport, and then prefabs. And we're going to drag in teleporting. Then you can make a plane, add a component to that called teleport area. And for me, you see this like cyborg looking grid. This will actually render in your world, so I don't personally want that. I just want the teleport to be invisible, so I'm going to turn off the mesh renderer. And then we will expand this to be the same size as our floor plane. You'll also have to bring this up a bit because it can't literally be buried in the floor. It has to kind of float above. So I'm going to put it the tiniest bit above so that I still land on the floor. And you can see the interface is a little different. By default, this shows my whole play area where I'm going to land, but relatively easy to link up. Now here's an interaction that I've found SteamVR to be particularly useful at. I want to create a button that's going to, in this case, turn on and off our movie over here. So I've created an empty game object that I called button, and I applied a hover button script from VRTK to it. And then inside that, I gave it a mesh, in this case just a cube. What the hover button does is it has a moving part. So you drag cube to moving part, and then it has a move distance. So in the Y direction, I want this to go down a little bit. And then down here, it's got properties about what happens when you press the button down, when the button comes back up, and what happens while the button stays pressed. So if we try this out, I will show you how it works. So in VR, I could just put my hand over this, but with the mouse, you can kind of press it down, and you'll see one press turns on our video player object, and now our movies run. And so the way I did that was I hooked up the Muybridge video player object here to the button down, and then here I went to game object and set it active, and made the video player inactive by default. There are a number of functions that you have access to depending on the object that you hook it up to. You know, I could make this like play and pause and stop, or fast forward or things like that instead by addressing video player rather than the whole object. And that might be something that allows you to do simple things like an escape room, you know, where you press this button and it makes a wall appear or disappear. Maybe it runs an animation that moves something up by addressing, you know, the animator component that's underneath an object, something like that. All of these interactions in SteamVR are demonstrated inside the interaction systems folder, and then samples. And there is actually a scene in there, interactions example. So if we save our scene, because we're about to jump out of it, and open up interactions example, there's a bunch of different scenes that I want to make you, or rather a bunch of different interactions that I want to make you aware of here. There are remotes that allow you to control other objects. Demos of different hand models that are available. Objects that won't go through a table, objects that will, objects that you can throw in two different ways in terms of the velocity. object that you can hover or pick up, and then it returns. Objects that have different properties when they land. This is a lever that can be used to control a separate object. This is also a good way to make a drawer or a door. A wheel that turns. Here's the button. Bow and arrow. And also light the arrow on fire. So the reason that I want you to know that these are here is because if you explore this and there's something you want to reproduce, like say for example, I wanted to learn how to make the hover button. Well, here's how I learned. This is the hover button script, you know, and this is an example of it all working. So you can, you know, click on each of these and see what their what the project has to have to require this thing to work. So like on the handle, you know, this one's an interactable. It also has this linear drive script that is what's running here, and it needs a start and an end. So you would make game objects in the right place. You can then drag this interactable between start and end, that kind of thing. So if there are certain interactions that are available in SteamVR that you see here that you want to try to reproduce, open this up, look at the game objects, see what was done, and see if you can make heads or tails of reproducing this in your project, because ultimately that's the next step in Unity, is starting to see if you can learn by pulling apart the tutorial projects that are provided and start making things work on your own. Okay, good luck.